Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Madly Learning. I want to start off our very first summer episode of PD by talking about you just taking a moment to realize all of the amazing things that you've accomplished this year. We tackled a pandemic and flipped to teaching online rather quickly, and we handled it like champions. And I just want to congratulate each and every one of you for doing that. Now, as we start our summer PD, the one thing I wanted to talk about is planning. Now is a great time while school is still a little bit fresh in your mind. If you've been able to take some of the weekend off, I always find that it's a great time to start thinking ahead to getting some planning done. I like to do it now, then take some breaks in between, and then come back to it again as the school year approaches. But I want to start some planning right now. But I also want to talk about my planning process. When I was first teaching, I feel like I made a lot of mistakes in my planning process, and I want to walk you through what those mistakes were, as well as how I've changed how I plan now and how that has served me better as a teacher. So if you are new to Madly Learning, welcome. My name is Patty, and I am the teacher behind madlylearning.com. And I have a weekly video that we put out every single week that talks about all things teaching using inquiry-based teaching practices in your junior grade classroom. So for this time period, we are definitely going to be talking about some planning and getting ready for the fall and using our time to get ourselves most prepared. So I talked last week about how I want to take the opportunity in the summertime to focus on some teacher PD, some professional development, that we can go through some ideas about what we can do to set ourselves up for success come September, in whatever September might look like. Now, we all recognize that September is probably going to look a lot different from every other September that we've encountered, but that doesn't mean that we cannot start planning and preparing for what that might look like. So I want to talk to you about some of the mistakes that I've made when I was a beginning teacher and I was beginning to sit down and plan out what my year would look like. One of the first things that I would do is planning is I would use the curriculum as a checklist. Now, the curriculum has hundreds and hundreds of expectations. Okay, maybe not hundreds and hundreds, but it has a lot of expectations. And initially, I would just simply look at them as a checklist and plan out which of those expectations I would do when, and kind of stack them as a to-do list instead of actually looking at that. Instead of actually looking at the curriculum in a much more macro sense. So from looking at the big ideas, I focused a lot on the specific expectations, looking at those kind of the smaller pieces of the curriculum planning, and really just looked at them like, okay, how could I run through these as quickly as possible, teach it, and then move on to the next expectation. That was really the way that I taught the first couple of years. But what I ended up finding with that approach is when you treat the curriculum or your program of study like it's a checklist that you just have to teach and move on, then what I found is that's exactly what happened with the learning for students. They would do the task and then move on and not think about it again. So real learning wasn't exactly happening. I also, as a teacher, felt completely overwhelmed because there was no way that I could get through the huge amount of expectations that we had if I simply looked at them like a checklist. One of the things I had to reteach myself about planning was that I had to look at the expectations more as a big idea, more as a puzzle piece, and I had to learn how to cover multiple expectations at once. Now, I did this with every subject. I did this with writing forms. I would simply look through the curriculum, find all of the examples of where they mentioned writing forms in the grade level I was teaching, and I would simply make a list of it and plan out, okay, what writing forms am I going to teach each month? And I would do it in reading comprehension. I'd pick a different reading comprehension strategy and I would just plot it out in an order that would make sense. And I would focus on one comprehension strategy at a time. And I would do it in math, where I would look at all of the units and I would simply just plot in those units month by month as to what I would cover. And I would never touch on those learning tasks again. It was a one and done solution. It never really worked. And it was never really the most effective way to get my students to actually learn the content that I wanted to teach them. When I focused on looking at expectations as a checklist instead of looking at it more holistically, some of the problems is I never had enough time. I never had enough time to capture everything. My students never really learned anything. I, in turn, felt completely overwhelmed and ineffective because I couldn't get it done, and I didn't really feel in my gut that students were actually learning it. I mean, I knew I covered it, but were they actually learning what I was covering? And because my goal is always on learning and retention, not on whether or not I taught it, but whether or not the students learned it, I really needed to change my approach as to how my planning was impacting my teaching and my students' learning. I also found when I looked at the curriculum as a checklist, it meant I taught like it was a checklist, which lacked giving the expectations and the learning any context in which my students could understand what I was talking about. So sure, I can teach making connections, and I can teach making connections with these specific books. But if I never talk about making connections again, then it just happens to be a thing my kids have to do, and they don't actually see how it ties into what happens outside of school. Making connections while you read is an integral part of your success as a reader. It's something you need to be doing so that you can make connections with what you read, and not just some books, but all books. Not just at some opportunities, but in all opportunities. It is what is happening in your brain when you're reading. So I needed to break away from, say, only teaching connections in October and then never really focusing them again the entire year. I also found that it was a lot harder to differentiate my instruction and meet the wide range of needs because I was so focused on teaching specific skills instead of teaching the student. So where was my focus really? Was my focus simply just teaching and teaching to curriculum, or was it actually teaching my students? And where was my focus? So I really needed to shift what I was actually doing. Now, so many teachers tackle the curriculum this way, probably because this is all we're given. We're given a curriculum document, but we're not exactly given a path in which we should follow. We're not actually given a lot of mentorship, and we're not given a lot of training on how we can look at the big ideas in the curriculum and actually fit those pieces together, and actually look at how, instead of teaching to a checklist, we actually teach to our students' needs and cover our curriculum along the way. We're still covering curriculum, but it's a shift in a mindset in terms of how you are approaching the teaching and the learning in your classroom, that it is student first and student driven instead of curriculum first and curriculum driven. Maybe you're with me. Maybe you're saying to yourself right now, yeah, that's totally me. I simply just look at the curriculum, make a list of the things I need to cover, and then plot it out on a calendar. If that's you and you're also feeling like maybe there's something different that you could be doing, if you're noticing that your kids are disengaged in their learning, if you are frustrated and overwhelmed yourself with feeling like you are never going to get through it all, or you are feeling like this is something that you really do want to change, because of course you know in your gut that you're here to teach students. You're not here to just cover a checklist provided to you by a minister of education that may not have ever been in a classroom. So we want to teach students. So here's what I did to change how I changed my thinking from looking at the curriculum as a checklist to looking at my students and figuring out how I could teach them the curriculum that I was going to need to cover. So this is going to seem a little bit strange, because I've just been saying how I don't want to talk about the curriculum as a list. However, step one of my planning process is still making a list. So yeah, there's still a place for these making lists, but it's not where you stop, it's where you start. So the first thing I do is I grab myself a notebook and I make a list. I make a list of the specific expectations and the genres and the forms, whether it's spelling, grammar, writing forms. I've got one for writing, for grammar and spelling too. But I list out exactly what is going to be a topic that is going to be covered during that time. But instead of taking that piece and then just simply plotting it out by month to month, I do another step first. So now that I have my list of expectations, but I'm going to take that list, put it to the side because I'm going to come back to it later. Now, what I'm actually planning out on my monthly calendar for what my long range plans are is themes, because I want to look at big general ideas, topics that I want to cover. I want to look at what other expectations, perhaps from science and social studies, that I want to cover each period of each term or each month. And I want to look at some of the big ideas. Now, for literacy, I really want to start focusing on character education, not necessarily topics of language instruction, but I want to focus on themes that we can cover that are relevant to what might be happening in the world during that time. It might be happening in terms of events or holidays that might be occurring around that time, but I really want to look at theme. I love focusing on character traits as my main theme and focus for each and every month. So for instance, in September, one of my focuses is going to be rules and responsibilities, because that is a huge focus of almost every classroom in September. As we're going over rules, we're going over expectations, and we want to set the groundwork and foundation for what our students need to learn. So I'm still not back to that list yet. I'm just looking at themes of topics that I want to cover. Once I've gone through the themes, my next step with literacy is to pick the book. Start with a theme, and then I pick a book. And I'm going to pick books that are going to cover those themes. Once I have the books picked out, and I'm going to use a lot of tools and resources to choose those books that fit with the different themes that I've picked each and every month, I'm going to pick about 4 or 5 picture books, as well as perhaps a chapter book that will be on my short list for books that we may read as a class, or books I may recommend for students to be reading independently during these times as well, because we're focusing on theme. Once I have my picture book, these are going to be my anchor books. These are going to be the books that I'm going to start pulling out different aspects of this book and fit curriculum to the book. So instead of fitting the book to the curriculum, now I'm going to go back to that list that I made, and I'm going to fit that list into the book that I've picked. So if I'm going to go ahead and pick a read aloud that talks about rules and responsibilities, I'm going to read through that book. And then I'm going to look at, okay, out of my list of curriculum expectations, what can I pull from? Is this a good book that will help me to teach making connections, or maybe making inferences? Is it better for predictions? I firmly don't believe that we need to just be teaching these things once and then we're done with them, or we even need to teach them step by step by step in a procedural way. I think it's okay that we spiral. In fact, I'm a big proponent of spiraling in all aspects of the curriculum. That students need to see it authentically in context, and they need to see it over and over and over and over again throughout the year, and their skills need to develop in tandem, both reading and writing, fiction and nonfiction, the writing process, writing forms. They need to see all of those develop all at once. So once I've picked reading comprehensions, I'm also going to look at specific writing forms that might lend themselves well. Perhaps this book is a great example of a different writing form that we can talk about it. Perhaps this book is a great example of character development or structure of plot. All of these are going to be features that I'm going to pull based on that theme and based on that book. So I'm going to start matching the curriculum expectations I need to cover to the theme and the book that I'm choosing. I'm going to go even further, and I'm going to put spelling and grammar and use the words within that picture book to pull them out and use them as models and mentor paragraphs to be able to teach concepts of spelling and grammar as they were actually demonstrated in the book that we're reading. That book becomes my anchor for lots of different aspects, and I can find multiple curriculum expectations that I can weave and fit into teaching that read aloud. This is how I plan. Now I will map all of this out on a spreadsheet. So give me a second. I'm going to show you what that looks like. So here on the screen is an example of how I will follow my planning process to plan an entire year's worth of expectations. What you're seeing here is actually the plans that I'm working on as I'm expanding my Ignited Literacy into a 3-4 as well as the 5-6 options, so that will be available be a 3-4 stream, a 4-5 stream, and a 5-6 stream of my Ignited Literacy program, which will be available and released in August. So I wanted to walk you through kind of how that process works. So again, I started with that list. Now I take the list of all of the things and I break down the curriculum expectations into its very basic steps, and I put that in a list, and then I put that list aside. Once the list is aside, then I start to plan this out. Now, the first thing I do is this first column here where it's by month, and I've picked a theme that has gone with each month. So for example, rules and responsibilities, great tie-in for September because that's really what we're talking about in class, rules and responsibilities. We also want to have basis of respect as we build community, which is why I've chosen that as my second theme. And then November being Remembrance Day is a huge feature in November. So courage is a great topic that is often great. So courage is a great topic to be discussing in November, as is kindness in December, because there are a lot of different holidays from different religions and different communities around the world that can focus on kindness and those celebrations of being with family all in December. So those are the kind of themes that I would follow. Now from there, once I've mapped out my themes, my next step is then to go and find some chapter books and picture books. Picture books are my number one, and then followed by some chapter books that also relate to that overall theme and are appropriate for the grade level that I'm working with. So once I have that picture book that I've selected, now it's time to go back to my list and to have my picture book and my theme. And it's at this point that I start pulling in expectations that relate to my picture book. So instead of trying to find resources that hit 1 or 2 expectations from my list, I instead start with the picture book and I find expectations that are a great tie-in with this book I have selected. So you'll notice that in September, one of the books that I'm suggesting to read is Officer Buckle and Gloria. Well, that is a great book on safety, on rules, on responsibility. It also has some tie-ins with friendship and letter writing as well. So we can look at where we are, and I can then pick which expectations might fit. Well, that book in particular is great with questioning and predictions. So it is one of the books that I use when I'm trying to teach questioning and making predictions, because students can make their predictions about what might happen to Officer Buckle and Gloria if the rules are not followed. They can make predictions as to what's going to happen with the characters at the school, as well as the relationship between the two main characters in that book. So it's a great one to also tie in with writing a recount, as students could recount an event in their own lives that was where they were not safe, or where rules were not followed, or why rules need to be followed. They can also do some retell, some summaries. There's lots of things that I can tie in to that book. So I've got to focus on the ones that are going to make the most sense based on kind of what we're doing in the classroom. But as you've noticed with that book, it inspires so many different ideas of things that I can start clustering and grouping expectations together and get a lot more covered in a shorter amount of time, because I'm starting with the theme, not starting with an expectation and then trying to pull other expectations to fit into that. It also means that I'm going to be spiraling. So is this the only time I'm ever going to talk about a recount? No, there will be more opportunities. It's also not the only time I'm going to be talking about making predictions and asking questions. I want to make sure that I will revisit those as we go further, because questioning and predicting is going to happen every time we read. It's not just going to happen in September. So I want to make sure that, am I going to cover every aspect of writing a recount that week? No, I'm going to pick parts of writing a recount, and I'm going to give them mini lessons about how to write a recount, or I might focus on the structure of a recount or how to plan a recount. And if the students don't know all the answers, that's okay. They're going to know the answers eventually as we continue to talk about recounts throughout the year. However, I don't need to give them all of the information in order for them to be able to write a semi-decent recount. And that was the realization that I came to, is that I don't need to front load everything, is that I can let my students sometimes take the lead and figure things out before I give them all of the information ahead of time. So it also is a great way to tie in grammar and spelling and relate that all back to the mentor text, because it allows students to see grammar and spelling concepts in practice in an anchor. So they see these grammar and spelling structures happening in the books that they're reading, and it's a great way for them to see those grammar and spelling lessons in context. So this is why I plan this way. It saves me time, and a book is far more inspirational to try to find expectations to attach to the book or to the theme than it is for me to try to plan a lesson that focuses primarily on one expectation. So instead of planning lessons for point of view, I plan point of view lessons for a book, and it saves me a ton of time. Now, I actually do something fairly similar in math. So in math, it seems to be that there is a push, or a bigger push, to spiraling. And I think it's still relevant to really look at spiraling, even with the advent of the new curriculum that was recently released in Ontario, or with whatever curriculum or programs of study you're working on. And I follow the same structure when I'm planning for math that I do for literacy. I list all of the basic skills that I'm supposed to cover, and then I begin to look at one main skill, so one topic, and I come up with a project that I can get students to do at the end. So for example, an All About Us project is a great get to know you type of project. And really my main focus for that is data management and graphing. So then I'm thinking, well, what kind of things could students graph about themselves? And are there any concepts from other math strands that I can group in with there, so that students might have to learn multiple different strands at the same time to complete that project? Well, an All About Us project, I can have students graphing things like weather, which is measurement when you're calling about temperature, time, weight, height, length, width. All of those aspects are things that can be graphed. So then I can group things like data management and measurement together, as well as understanding numbers or even decimals and place value, and I can group those learning concepts together to put a project together. So for me, spiraling looks like little mini units with a culminating project that combines those multiple units together and allows students to apply what they've learned in those little mini units to that overall project. This is something that I started implementing about 2 years ago, and I've refined it, and I have to say my students really loved having projects that they could work on. So instead of focusing on place value and having the entire month of September be about place value, I focused on mini units, knowing that I wasn't going to cover all aspects of data management, but I was going to cover a small amount of data management. So I was going to cover bar graphs. So we quickly went over bar graphs, and we talked about the different components that are required in a bar graph and how to make them and what it looked like and why we use them. And we covered that in about a week. And then we moved on to looking at place value. So we focused on place value for a week. Place value with decimals. Then we moved on to measurement, and we continued to talk about decimals and place value as we were talking about units of measurement and how we can convert between units of measurement. Now, measurement took a little bit longer, so we talked about that for 2 weeks. At the end, we were able to come up with a project where students could measure different aspects about themselves and then graph the data that they came up with. And because they were graphing in units of measurement, using decimals was a pretty important thing to do, because a lot of the times when we weigh or measure things, it's not going to be perfectly exact to say a whole centimeter or a whole kilogram or a whole gram. So we can then group those expectations together and have a culminating project that our students can complete on each one of those things. So you can do mini units instead of one large unit that covers every expectation for that aspect. Now, I know for myself, as I'm simply working through this new math curriculum, and this is a process that takes some time, but I'm looking at making my list of the different expectations, looking at how I can group them together, and also looking at how those can be pulled and removed, and maybe something where I'm not teaching necessarily a unit, but it's built into an aspect like a classroom management for financial literacy, or coding can be built into some science activities. How can we look at taking some of the math strands and making them an everyday occurrence, so that we can be looking at those things not necessarily as a unit, but as a practical application of our learning each and every day or once a week in our classrooms. So as I'm working through those planning phases to update my long-range plans for the long-range plans that I sell, as well as the ones that I give away for free on my website, you will have access to those as soon as they're updated. But it is a process, so it takes a bit of time for me to work through how everything fits together. Now, these term 1 and term 2 big idea projects are not something that I currently have as an offer for people to purchase and buy, because it's not built out. It's just a plan. But it is something that is on the to-do list to do. It's just not currently done yet. But I wanted to show you a way that you can also use the big idea planning to plan a spiraled approach to math, same as you do for literacy. My goal is always to make my life simpler and more efficient, because I don't have a ton of time to be spending being overwhelmed or in a sense of that I can't get everything done. I don't have time for that thinking and feeling. And I want to always find ways to be efficient in how I tackle the immense amount of expectations that I am required to cover. So the best way I have found to do that, as always, is to cluster and group expectations, but not where I'm focusing on the expectation first, but I'm focusing on a big idea or a theme or even a project that I can then attach expectations to, multiple expectations to, from various strands, so that I can do more in less time. So I hope that has given you a glimpse as to how you can reframe your thinking about planning and how you can get yourself prepared for going back to school, even if we're not exactly sure the structure of what school is going to look like. But if you've got some big ideas and you know where you're going and you know how you're going to pull everything together, it is a lot of upfront planning now. It does take some time. I won't lie to you there, but you're going to thank yourself come September when this is done. As always, if you would like access to my long-range plans, you can find those on www.madlylearning.com and scroll to the blue box that has the long-range plans. Click the button and you can sign up, and they will be sent to your email right away. If you're somebody who wants those plans editable, you can also grab those on TPT for a fee. Ignited Literacy is changing, and it's going to be updated and expanded to meet more teachers' needs. I will have access for a grade 3-4, a 4-5, and a 5-6 program for Ignited Literacy. Additionally to that, for the first time ever, I'm also going to be offering a VIP coaching group for those that are also going to be my Ignited Literacy teachers. Ignited Literacy changed my teaching for the better. It engaged my students, and I can't wait for you to try it in your classroom too. So again, the web address that you can go to sign up for the waitlist is going to be www.ml/go.com/IL2020. Bye for now.